Hi everyone. One of the questions I often receive from my students is that my photo's not sharp, my photo's not as crisp as yours. What's going on? If you search around, there'll be a lot of answers like could be your shutter speed, could be your focusing, could be your low light, could be a subject moving. There can be lots of issues and that's fine, but what you want to do is you actually want to investigate down further and understand what's causing your images to be blurry or not as sharp. And there are technically two types of reason which could cause your photos to lose the sharpness. One of them is what we call the motion blur, where the camera is moving or the subject's moving in the frame. And the other type is called the focal blur, where it's about the focusing issue. So for example, if you're photographing a portrait, your focus should be on the eyes, but sometimes you might have occasionally focus on the nose or the ears or the hair or somewhere else which is not the eyes, and that could make your portraits look a little bit blurry as well. So we're going to figure out first. Let's look at that. Technically, your photograph should be sharp wherever you want it to be. For example, in this photograph, it's a reasonably sharp photograph. You can see that the text are pretty sharp when you zoom in as well. But this is not the case for other photographs. For example, if you look at that, this looks a bit blurry, and that as well. And here, this photograph as well. So we want to determine what is the reason of the blur. If you zoom in closer to investigate further, you can see that the blur is actually going on in one direction. And look at this example again as well. So you can see that the blurry actually is going towards this direction. In this example, it may be a little bit less noticeable, quite subtle the blur is, but if you zoom in there, you can still see that is still blurry and it's going towards that direction. So that basically explains this is caused by the motion blur. And the second type of blur is the focal blur. The focal blur is actually caused by the focusing issues. Let's take a look at this picture. This image looks seemingly okay at a glance, but if you zoom in further, you can see the eyes aren't actually sharp. What's worse is that there are other parts of the photograph which are actually quite sharp. For example, look at the hair here. For example, look at the flowers over there. So they're actually sharp, but not the eyes. That means the focus was actually locked on the hair or the flowers instead of the eyes, and that is the problem with the focusing there. Let's give you another example. This picture looks a little bit sharper, but still has the same problem. When you zoom in further, you can see the eyes, and this time around now even the hair is in focus. What you want to do is you might want to look around and see if there are other objects which are in focus. A good portrait should look like this. If you look in there, the eyes have to be really sharp. The eyelashes are usually the good indication that your focus is locked on the eye. Here is another example. So you can see that the eyelashes are really sharp, and that basically means the focus is spot right on the eye. And pretty much when you're photographing a portrait, your focus should be on the eyes, like you can see here. As another example, as you can see here, a good portrait should be sharp from the eyes and all the way out from there. The problem with focal blur is often a little bit harder to determine than the motion blur. Let's take a look in here. For an example, in this picture, you can see the picture is quite blurry, but a little bit hard to tell whether it is the focal blur or the motion blur right here. One of the clues that you want to look for is look around the photograph. Ask yourself, are there other parts of the image? Are there other subjects in the image which are actually sharper than your main intended objects? And then you can see from here, the box there is actually in focus. So that means this is a focal blur. This means the photographer has locked on a wrong subject. Similar here as well. If you look into this picture, you can see they're kind of blurry. But if you look around closely, you will notice that the text here on the magazine is actually pretty sharp. So that means the focus was on this plane instead of the books here. Now I've put up the two photographs side by side. So you can see here, so determine which one is a focal blur, which one is a motion blur here. So it's a bit harder to tell in this scenario. If you look at that, they could be both, but one of the biggest tips you can see, zoom in. If you look closely here though, you can see that the little eye there actually has a bit of a directional blur. That is a pretty clear indication this is the motion blur. Whereas if you look on this picture there, the eye has a more even out blurry to the softer edges. So this is usually caused by the focal blur. Hopefully that helps you understand better about your issue, whether you're facing the focal blur or the motion blur. Now that you know what's causing your photographs to be less sharp or a bit blurry, let's find out how do we fix that. Usually the main reason that causes the motion blur is the shutter speed. And you want to keep an eye on the shutter speed all the time. The three things that you want to look out for. Number one, follow this general rule that your shutter speed should be at least double your focal length or faster. What does it mean by that? For example, if you're photographing at 50mm lens, that means your focal length is 50mm. On a 50mm, what you want to do is you want to make sure that you're photographing at a shutter speed no slower than 1/100 second. And another example, if you're photographing at, let's say, 70mm. On a 70mm focal length, your shutter speed should be set at least 150 of a second or faster. So that is a general guideline which will help you minimize the camera shake or the shutter shake. Number 2, even while you're following the guideline, make sure your shutter speed isn't going any slower than 60 of a second or so. What I mean by that is 60 of a second may be okay for most subjects, but if the subject in the frame is moving, the subject will be blurred. It's not going to matter whether you have your camera on the tripod or you have a really good stabilizing option. Most of the subjects, if they're not standing still, there is a good chance the camera will cause a shutter shake. Sometimes I've seen that mistakes people do that. They put a camera on a tripod, but they crank the shutter speed to like about 1 second or half a second taking portraits, and it's not going to work because human beings will not be able to stand still for 1 second or even half a second. So keep that in mind. And number 3, make sure you hold the camera really steady. And a lot of times, some people tend to hold the camera away from the body. As you can see there, the camera is not going to be very steady in my hands. So try to tuck the camera towards your body if you can. And as you can see here, if you tuck the camera towards your body, that also makes it easier for you to hold the camera. What if your images are blurry because of the focal blur? So there are also 3 things that I want you to look into. Number 1, one of the biggest reasons that a lot of photos are blurred is the manual focus. Yes, I repeat, manual focus can be evil, especially when you're starting out, when you're new to the camera. Remember, most of the time we're looking through the tiny little viewfinder. And it's very difficult to tell whether you are focusing on the nose, the eyes, or the ears, or the hair, or something else. As you gain more experience, you will learn to focus better. But when you're starting in the photography journey, I would say ditch that manual focus for a while. Number 2, use the eye tracking if your camera has the feature. Now the autofocus technology is so much advanced that the camera can track the eyes, human eyes, animal eyes, objects, vehicles, and so on. But if your camera doesn't have that feature, use a single point or 1-point focus. I've been using that system for all my career. What you want to do is fix a single point, position where you want to focus that, and lock the focus on the eye of your model or the subject. Remember, if your subject moves, refocus and relock your focus again. That way, you will make sure that the focus is always on the eye and nowhere else. Number 3 is a little technical part, but it's all about understanding the sweet spot of your lens. If you do a bit of a research of the sweet spot, you will notice that there will be a lot of charts and figures and tables, everything you will see on the internet. I'll save you the trouble here. Let's take a look at this lens again. This is a 50mm f1.8 lens. That's a really good value for money, beautiful entry-level prime lens. It shoots wide open at aperture f1.8 and is really great for portraits, even objects, still life. It's a really great value for money lens. However, just like many lenses in the market, this lens does not deliver the sharpest quality when you shoot open at f1.8. So what you want to do generally is to find the sweet spot. You normally want to crank your aperture down to about 2 to 3 stops. So instead of shooting at f1.8, you want to crank your aperture down to about f2.8, f3.2, or even f3.5. This is where this lens will deliver the sharpest quality images. Alternatively, if you have a lens like f1.2 50mm, this lens will deliver decent quality photos at f1.2. Pretty good, I would say. But the sharpest pictures this lens will deliver is usually around f1.8, f2.0, or higher numbers. So in short, if you have a lens that opens the aperture like f2.8, crank the aperture values to about 2 to 3 stops. And that's where you want to shoot most of the time. If you want to deliver really sharp images, the best out of a lens, that's where you will get that. But lastly, there's one of the possibilities that I wouldn't rule out. It's unlikely, but there's a possibility that your lens might have some defects. In this scenario, if you try all the things that I've mentioned above, but you're still running into blurry images, you still feel that your images aren't as crisp as they should be, what you should do is try borrowing another similar or the same lens from a friend or a camera rental center and try comparing the results. And you might be able to see if there's a problem with the lens or anything. So remember, what you want to do is make sure you understand what's causing the blur of the images, whether it's a motion blur or whether it's the focal blur. If it's a motion blur, remember that double the focal length rule. Number 2, make sure that your shutter speed doesn't fall below 60 of a second or so. If your shutter speed falls below 60 of a second, it's okay to shoot, but keep an eye out. And also make sure you hold the camera steady so that it doesn't create a lot of camera shake. And then if your photos are blurry because of the focal blur, remember to ditch the manual focus for a while. Instead, switch to single point or one point autofocus. Set the focus point where you want it to be and lock that focus on the eye of your subject, and always make sure that you're focusing on the eye instead of anything else. And lastly, understand the sweet spot. So if your lens open up to f1.8, you want to crank it down to about f2.8 or 3.2, 3.5 so that you could get the sharpest quality out of a lens. Hopefully this video helps. And if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to leave a comment down below and follow me for more video and photography tips. And I will see you in the next video.